Hello, and welcome to another episode in Brooklyn Law School's series on law in time of crisis. We have discussed all manner of ways in which the health pandemic intersects with the legal world. And today we are here to talk about the world of white-collar crime with someone who is perfectly positioned to discuss that topic, Professor Miriam Baer, who has seen white collar crime from a number of angles as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, as an in house corporate counsel at Verizon, and now as a scholar who explores issues of crime and compliance in the corporate world. Miriam, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, Michael.
So maybe we can start by talking, before we get to criminal law, we can talk about crime itself and how, in a pandemic situation, the incidence of crime is affected. Is the amount of crime that we can expect to take place in the white collar context higher or lower in a pandemic setting, or are there particular types of scheme or crime that we can expect to see more or less of when we have a pandemic situation?
Sure. And I think, that the way to think about a pandemic, it's like any crisis, it offers opportunities. We often, and this is particularly relevant to a particular type of white collar crime, which is fraud. So when we think about why does someone use deceit to obtain someone else's money, which is sort of the core of fraud, criminologists frequently refer to what's called the fraud triangle. Okay, so they talk about pressure, they talk about opportunity, and they talk about rationalizations. The rationalizations might be the rationalizations that the fraudster tells himself. I'm not really doing anything wrong. I'm entitled to this. So anytime you have a crisis, that's going to ratchet up in some areas pressure, but it's also going to create opportunities, right? So, and maybe even allows you to give yourself some rationalizations. So if I'm a prosecutor, and in fact, the Department of Justice has done this, I'm going to be thinking about how do I protect the public against certain types of problems that I would expect to show up not just in a pandemic, but under any kind of sort of quick acting crisis. And so you're going to first be looking for folks who might be taking advantage of COVID. And they can take advantage of COVID in multiple ways, but two ways stand out. One is you're going to worry about people who are offering or selling things that people need in a pandemic that maybe aren't what they claim them to be. So, hey, I've got these amazing masks. They're going to prevent you from getting sick at all. They're N95 masks, but they're not. Or I've got a shipment and I'm going to send it right to you, but there's nothing in the shipment, right? So those are sort of standard, I have something, I'm pretending to have something, and it's not real. But then there are other ways that people can use the pandemic as an excuse to sort of take advantage of others. So for example, you could concoct a charity scheme and call people and solicit their email address, their social security number, their bank accounts, their contributions, saying, we're creating up a charity for people who got sick from COVID or their families. And it turned out, you're just walking away with money. So that's one set of folks I'd worry about. Another group of taking advantage, I might add, are the folks that, remember, the government itself now has created funds, opportunities for example, small businesses can apply for loans, right, under certain circumstances if they meet the criteria. And the idea is the money in those loans is supposed to be for paying your employees so the business can stay afloat while we're in the middle of this pandemic. We know this already because there have been some cases. We know there are folks applying for that. Anytime you have a big pot of money that the government is offering, what are we worried about? We're worried about that someone's going to try to get that money under false pretenses, right? So that's another set where the government itself is a victim. And then I would look for folks who it's not directly COVID related. It's not necessarily like, oh, hey, I can go take advantage of someone by pretending to have masks or a vaccine. But instead, it's that COVID itself has ratcheted up the pressure in so many businesses, right? In other words, we have free falls in businesses. We have people who cannot literally make their bills. And that is where I think you get pressure and rationalizations, where you say to yourself, just this once, I'm going to lie a little bit about my book. I'm going to cook my books just a little bit. I'm going to lie this time. And I'm doing it because this is a crisis. And as soon as I get back on my feet, I'm going to fix everything. That's a different kind of fraud because it's not going to be directly related to COVID. It's not going to have anything, it's not going to have the bells and whistles of COVID. And yet it will probably arise out of COVID. So 2-3 years down the road, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some fraud type crimes where if you ask the defendant, why did you start doing this? When did you start doing this? Someone says, well, it all started during the crisis. There was a shortfall in revenue. I couldn't make, my numbers. I had to do something, so I cooked the books.
So that's interesting. So with the change in culture, or in some ways the lack of culture and personal interaction, that can have possibly a negative effect on the ability of the compliance officers to promote good culture. Might it also be helpful in preventing conspiracies, so people have less opportunity to talk about bad things, and maybe the risk of crime is more a risk of a single rogue person trying to engage in fraud for their own benefit?
I think it's going to very much depend. And I think also one thing that'll be interesting will be you have to also balance new conspiracies versus ongoing ones. In other words, you have to assume, and we know that as a general rule, many conspiracies in the sort of corporate white collar world, at least for some time, are not caught, right? They go unchecked. They sort of have to bubble up before finally they get to that point where they either, if it's a Ponzi scheme, it sort of collapses. If it's a bribery scheme, eventually you figure out that somebody's corrupt, but it takes a while. So there's sort of two things going on. There are the schemes that were previously existing. And there's a sort of question of, well, for the folks who already had a scheme, does this allow for an easier time not getting caught? Because let's be honest, compliance also, there's another thing, the shift to remote has distracted all of us, right? We're all thinking about just keeping everything going. And so does that sort of distract everyone such that whatever pre-existing scheme you had, you're able to sort of keep it bubbling and nobody sees it? And you gotta do a trade-off there. Maybe that scheme keeps going and we don't catch it. But then there are other, as you point out, maybe there are newer schemes that don't happen because, as you say, well, people aren't in the same room, so they can't think to engage in a conspiracy. By the way, that's also going to be very company specific, division specific, department specific, because as you say, well, okay, that might be true that we're not all in the same building, but maybe 5 of us live in the same town. And maybe we're in a town where we're not really social distancing as much as the next town. So these are all issues for a compliance officer. The compliance officer may be located in the New York City headquarters. I'm social distancing. I'm not going anywhere. I'm sitting in my apartment getting on Zoom calls with, top people. But unbeknownst to me, there's some department somewhere else that's in a city, state, wherever, where maybe there's less social distancing. Notice that has effects on whether or not there's opportunities for face-to-face interaction, which then could theoretically, again, I don't think it has a direct impact like immediately, but could have some impact later on for conspiracies and fraud crimes.
You talked about the policing function of compliance. Obviously, the policing function is also served by the police. So how is law enforcement on the part of external agencies rather than internal compliance officers impacted by a pandemic or other crisis of this kind?
There are the things we see and the things we don't see, right? So the things we see, particularly with regard to these sort of taking advantage schemes. In other words, all these kinds of fly-by-night schemes where someone calls you up and says, hey, I've got great masks and I've got great hand sanitizer and I've got a new vaccine that, we all know is wrong, but that will make you feel better within a day. Those kinds of schemes, the Department of Justice has made very clear, and it came out it was the end of March. They started by saying they were going to have a task force to deal with hoarding and price gouging. And then they sort of announced that they wanted all the U.S. attorneys' offices to have sort of a coordinator person who was going to be in charge of basically anything related to these kinds of scam schemes, phishing schemes, by the way, also getting something on your computer saying, hey, you've got a COVID problem, give us your social security number, any of that kind of stuff is now, the Department of Justice has a fair number of things on its website saying, here's where you can call. There's a national disaster fraud center that you can call to, report that you think you've been a victim. So in that sense, I would say, and now, by the way, if you do a search on Google, you'll see the U.S. Attorney's offices, your local U.S. Attorney's office almost surely by now has a joint task force, probably with like your state enforcement. It would be like your AG, your Attorney General, your Department of, your District Attorney. There's a whole bunch of sort of state, federal, cooperative groups right now who are working on what I would call the taking advantage element of this. So in that sense, you could say the government's got that covered. They're worrying about that stuff. They're looking for that stuff. They're responding to that stuff. And actually, you can start to see cases that are showing up on the Department of Justice's website. Where I think the Department of Justice is less likely to be successful and at least immediately confronting would be the other types of fraud scheme. In other words, the sort of downstream effects. The fact that there are people right now who, because their businesses just took a terrible hit, what kinds of temptations does that create? What kind of impulses does that unleash? Do those unleash? And to the extent there were pre-existing schemes, how is the Department of Justice thinking about the fact that, we've got pre-existing schemes? To what extent, now that we've all gone remote, is that going to become a problem? Or just, by the way, another example, when I buy something in person, I can inspect it. If I'm going to buy more things online, that creates different types of opportunities for fraud, because my information asymmetry between the person selling and the person buying has widened, because most of the time I can't see, there are things that I can't inspect physically, means that I'm at a disadvantage. So all that kind of stuff, I'm sort of interested to watch to see how that unfolds and how the government handles that.
So one final question, asking about how this pandemic has affected your own scholarship. Has it led you to think that you agree or disagree with anything that you've said in the past even more firmly, or that you have new projects perhaps that are informed by things that are happening out in the world that you see around you? Or is there anything that has sparked your thinking or informed your thinking that you're seeing out in the world of the pandemic?
I don't know that this is related directly to the pandemic, but again, insofar as you call, I would feel this way probably about a national disaster as much as I'd feel about a specific pandemic. But I would feel this way: is anytime you have these kinds of sort of sudden shocks, right, to our everyday life, you're very dependent on two things. You're dependent on people sort of exercising their own goodwill and their own sense of self-restraint, their care for their fellow human being. And you're also reliant on good government systems. You need good government institutions. If people respect each other and care about each other, and if people respect their government, then you hope that those two things are going to sort of keep other types of wrongdoing in check. I've always said this in my scholarship: I don't think you can ever get to a point of no wrongdoing. I mean, unless we were all dead. That, other than that, if you believe that, like wrongdoing's, I've always thought of wrongdoing, particularly in corporations, as sort of like a chronic issue. Sometimes it flares up and sometimes they bring it back down. And the idea is to sort of treat it like a chronic issue that, from time to time you take your Robitussin and you go on your merry way. What I think the pandemic has shown is, to the extent we have other problems in our culture, to the extent we have fraying cultural connections, to the extent that people really don't trust their government institutions, to the extent we have worries that the government itself isn't functioning well, right? The pandemic exacerbates that. And that then feeds into a greater opportunity, both for sort of these low-level schemes, and then on top of that, for these sort of corporate misconduct problems. So it's not that it will, I don't see, I don't think it's going to change my scholarship, but if anything, it affirms for me the importance, if you want to reduce fraud, only apart from having good prosecutors and good internal compliance departments, you need good government. You need government institutions that function well and that are well respected. Until we get to that point, we're going to have problems with everything else.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Miriam Baer, for these thoughts about white-collar crime and our efforts to combat it in the world challenged by a global pandemic. Thanks to you all for watching, and stay tuned for our next episode in our series on law in time of crisis.